on improving Indigenous media. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that we're on Anishinaabe territories. Thank you for being here. The goal of this panel is to talk about the issues that we face in grassroots media, addressing or trying to improve and cover Indigenous issues. And we'd like to collectively come up with some solutions on how we can improve it. So we're just going to introduce ourselves, and then we'll go around and give a quick introduction of everyone. Everyone can say who they are and what brings them here, and why improving Indigenous media is important to them. My name's Ashley Zarbatany, and I am a mixed Anishinaabe, of mixed settler and Indigenous descent. I am involved in the media co-op, and I got involved in the media co-op. I should speak into this. I got involved in the media co-op very recently. I've been involved in solidarity activism and social justice activism for quite a few years, and it was through my involvement with activism that I realized the necessity and the importance of the media. We would often organize demonstrations or different actions, and no one would show up. Well, people would show up, but the media wouldn't show up. And it was organizations like the Media Co-op, the CKUT, and other grassroots organizations that would come and give us representation in the media that got our messages out. But I realized quickly that there wasn't enough coverage going on. So that kind of motivated me to think more about the importance of getting involved in the media and owning the media ourselves. And I really like the concept of the media co-op because it's all about collectively owning the media and being involved in it, and being involved in that process. So when I was asked about 6 months ago to sit on the Dominion, which is the print publication for the media co-op, as a guest editor, I was very enthusiastic, and I was asked to come on as to kind of lead or spearhead and get involved in the Indigenous land defense issue, which y'all have a copy of. So yeah, I was really excited about that and jumped into it, and it was through my experience with this special issue that I decided to get more involved in the media co-op, and that's what has brought me here today. So that's why I'm here, and that's who I am.
My name's Ariel. Hello. Well, my name's Ariel. I'm a settler, and I'm very thankful to be here on Anishinaabe territory talking to you today at this panel, or this workshop. Yeah, I guess like my experience getting involved with the media runs parallel to Ashley's in a lot of ways. I started off doing activism and found over and over again that the mainstream media just wasn't covering what was happening very accurately. Like they'd deliberately, seemingly underestimate the number of people at demos, misquote people, sometimes not focus on the message at all, but just discuss like confrontations with the police and stuff like that instead. And so I became involved in independent media. Started when I was in university at UBC on a publication called The People's Guide to UBC. I also worked on a public print publication called Margins, which is a feminist magazine in Vancouver. And most recently, about a year and a half ago, I got involved in the media co-op, and particularly in publishing the Dominion. Most of my experience with Indigenous news and Indigenous media is through the most recent copy of the Dominion, which you all hopefully have a copy of, which is focused on land defense struggles and is entirely, all the contributors in that issue are Indigenous. Definitely learned a lot publishing that issue, and very excited to just have a discussion with you guys today about how we can improve Indigenous media.
I need my glasses. Hello, everyone. My name is Clair, and I'm from Ilsibuktuk. And my native name is Oadnugapkisnukipkasan. Leo Ilsibuktuk. Welalio Dandeli Kisiluyo Gisuk Nige Uchit Nige the Temudi Inashinabe territory. Kuduaganudumulotnin Tangoining Gisabudayap. Maudum igani involved Walsianic media Nadango Idelia of Ilsibuktuk in 2013. I'm going to translate it in English. Hello, my name is Clair. My native name is Northern Southern Rain. And I don't always use my name. I usually just supposed to use it when we have ceremonies or gatherings with the elders or when we have ceremonies. So I'm very honored to be here in Anishinaabe territory. And when I first got involved in the media is when the protest happened in Ilsibuktuk. I noticed that there was not enough media going on about Indigenous people and the problems that we're having with the lands. And the reason why I'm here today is to improve that they need to have more media and talk about it, about the Indigenous people and the issues. So I think it's really important that we support like the Dominion or Halifax Media Co-op, because I found that they were the only ones that came and wrote articles and talked about what was going on. So I'm honored to be here and thank you for coming.
So we're wanting to just ask, we wanted this to be more of a participatory workshop. This is set up like a panel, but so if you want to get closer, feel free. But we'd like to go around and ask you who you are and why you're here and what brings you here and what interests you in this topic and why you care about independent media. And there's a mic there, which can be passed around.
Is it actually? Okay, yeah, it's working. Hi, I'm Daria. Hello, everybody. And I'm Daria Marchinkova, and my interest in independent media is mostly from the perspective of building kind of committees, like media committees of organizations or of movements. So how do our organizations actually produce media themselves and get media out themselves? That's kind of mostly the work that I've done around media and communications, and I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, let's take it off the stand. My name is Aaron, and I'm from Montreal. And my interest in this is, it's hard to sum up, but I mean, just even looking at something like this is really beautiful and amazing. And I guess I kind of want to know how to support initiatives like this, or, you know, like I've listened to Annie's podcast before, just like knowing that there's really incredible Indigenous media out there, and probably could be, I guess, maybe more of a discussion amongst non-Indigenous people in terms of like maybe how to reallocate resources that we might have in our communities in terms of like putting those towards supporting Indigenous produced media.
Hi, everybody. My name is Aruna. Sorry, this is like lots of people around, so I just want to make sure I see all of you. I am from Toronto, which is also the traditional territory of Mississauga's New Credit, Three Fires Confederacy, and Huron-Wendat peoples. And I am here because I have done a lot of media stuff in the past, and I've been a community organizer in Toronto for a long, long time, and also know how much media is needed and getting out different kinds of information and struggle. And I'm currently the news editor for Indigenous Waves radio show at CIUT in Toronto. And I also am the advice columnist for Shameless Magazine, which is a magazine for young women and trans people. So I do different kinds of media stuff, but I practice law during the day, so I'm all over the place. But yeah, my interest is also as a non-Indigenous person, non-Indigenous to here person, trying to figure out how to do media coverage that it reflects and also supports the struggles that are happening for Indigenous communities across Canada. Indigenous Waves covers only stuff in Canada in terms of what we cover on the news, but trying to figure out how to do that better and well and support movements better. So.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sumaya. My interest in media is lies in content creation and creating media, mostly by, for, and about communities that I navigate. But I'm here specifically because I just want to listen and learn about Indigenous media and content creation, and hopefully maybe figure out ways in which I can support in that kind of creating links and allyship and support, etc.
Hi, my name is Bryce. Yeah, I'd say my interest is similar of I'm newly getting into media creation and doing my own thing, and I think it's important to recognize that even if you are an oppressed person yourself, there's other groups and other peoples to keep in mind, and I think that's an important thing to do. And I'm originally from the States, and we don't talk about Indigenous peoples at all, so when I came to Canada, I started learning more about Indigenous people and struggles they've been going through and their histories a little bit. So while I've been here, I've been trying to keep up with that and to be more aware of that situation and to keep that in mind in my own thoughts and practices going on. So yeah.
My name is Carolyn. I am from Montreal, and I was hired actually for the Media Co-op, I guess more than half a year ago now, and I had the lovely opportunity of working with Ariel and Ashley on this issue, so helping support them in this work. And it was a really great and huge learning opportunity in terms of a lot of the stuff that ended up being covered in this issue I had never even heard about. There's so much organizing happening that just isn't covered at all, even by independent media sources as well. So yeah, I guess moving forward, I'd like to support whatever work is being done, and trying to help make more of that work being done.
Hi, my name is Miles. Yeah, I've had the good fortune to be able to collaborate with Annie on a variety of projects, and it's been a pretty incredible experience just to be able to sort of. I guess I started as a journalist who was reporting on environmental issues, and then by I guess some chance opportunities began to shift focus a little bit towards Mi'kmaq issues and First Nations issues in the Maritimes. And then what I found is that linking those two together, what began to happen for me was that I was sort of wound up covering conflict and situations like that, and then sort of even, if you're on side or if you're not mainstream, you're still independent and you still are sort of to a greater or lesser degree wearing a parachute and coming into a community, and then leaving. And then so my interest is really sort of seeing and supporting the media that gets made on a when the struggle sort of turns to a low burn, when people aren't wearing camo or lighting tire fires, and I'm not saying that's by no means the wrong thing to be doing. It's just sort of, there is a day-to-day existence that does not involve doing that, and issues on the res, reclamation of history, language retention, stuff like that. So it's been, and creating narratives that do bring up role models and people you can, like, within a First Nation community that's often sort of not seeing itself reflected in the media, and maybe not always gravitating towards direct action resistance role models, and sort of finding perhaps people, like right now we're working, writing a biography of a man who is one of the pioneers of creating Indigenous specific rehabilitation programs for drugs and alcohol, and we're writing his biography like in a partnership. So it's just it's an incredible experience to be able to assist, and I'm just interested to learn more about how we do reallocate resources, like you're saying, and then sort of use whatever potential research skills or grant writing skills or production skills that we might have acquired to help lay the foundation, training, stuff like that. So I'm interested in initiatives, collaborations, networking towards that effect right now. Thanks.
I guess I have a lot of the similar interests to Miles. I'm David. Do mostly like freelance journalism. I started off with the media co-op, and then I've like gone through a lot of sort of like semi-alternative media stuff like Rabble, Now Toronto, Vice, and I've seen some ways that those places do or do not do well in covering Indigenous life and land and all those issues. So at this point, I've like sort of started slowing down on my writing, and I'm more just working on like connecting people to various media outlets. But I'm interested in like figuring out how I fit in and where my voice is, like, because I do a lot of sort of talking to settlers, and I don't know, like I'm sort of questioning where my voice is right now in all of that.
Hi everyone, I'm Carol. I feel like everyone's mom here actually. I'm not as involved as all of you guys, but I'm here more as a spectator and attendee to gain more information about independent media and various other issues that will come up. So thank you.
Ani Bojo, hello. My name is Devin Cascagnette. I'm actually just here to see my good friend Ashley. I'm really excited that she's here. I'm blown away. So I live in near Midland, Métis homeland around there. And yeah, I'm just stoked to see this person and hear her speak because she's a genius. So that's all.
Hi, Ezra. I'm interested in Indigenous cinema, so I'm here to also learn about Indigenous media and its other forms, including news, and I'm just interested. That's all.
Hi, I'm Svetla, and I'm also interested in the role of self-representation in decolonization of the media and the institutions and practices that we are all part of. So I'm here to learn more and hopefully listen.
Hi, I'm Sandra. I'm here to listen and learn.
Okay. Yeah, my name is Abiodun. I research majorly in indigenous language media in Africa, so it is natural that I'll be curious to know what you want to say about indigenous news. So that is why I'm here.
So we just wanted to ask the question, what are some of the myths or assumptions that we see in the media about colonization? And we're just going to try to myth bust for a little while here. Yeah, I can start. One myth that I have seen a lot is the idea that Indigenous rights are just like any other right, like women's rights or LGBTQ rights, and it's just another thing about getting representation in the media or in electoral politics, or just that rights framework, versus there being Indigenous nations that we're asserting sovereignty and we want decolonization. So, that's one myth. But we can go around, and if you have any ideas about myths or assumptions that you have or that you see about colonization in the media, we'll just jot it down. You can just lift your hand up and I'll bring the mic to you.
I see this in things like guidebooks and stuff about Canada, that it wasn't brutal here. That in the United States it had a brutal history, but here it wasn't brutal or violent.
That it's over, that like colonization is a thing that happened a long time ago and we're past that.
Totally.
I don't know if this is what you're getting at, but I have two. One is that you don't pay taxes, so therefore you don't have the right to, to make demands of the state. And the other one is that the 60s scoop and the removal of Indigenous children, that's also in the past, whereas the truth is that's really happening today.
Thank you. Do you have any?
I think in the media there's a message that it's like all about money and it doesn't talk about land.
Yeah, totally. There's this like idea that also that band councils are traditional.
Also, kind of in line with that is that one voice, one Indigenous voice is the voice. So if one person in a band council says, we love like the Tarzans and we really want to support that and make money off of it, that's how all Indigenous people think across the board. Totally. So like generalizing Indigenous voice. And another one is also thinking of that Indigenous people have not contributed at all to where we're at right now in Canada. So not also understanding that the resource extraction is a huge part of that whole process of colonization. Passive, yeah, or even idle. Yeah.
Me is when they say warriors. Right away they say warriors are the ones that want to start war. That's not true. Warriors are people that's supposed to protect the women, the children, and the community. It's protection. It's not to start war. And they're not terrorists.
I would just say that most settlement in Canada is even legal.
Yeah.
Is it okay if I do another one?
Oh yeah, please.
Okay, so I found some of the coverage, well, probably a lot of the coverage of the missing and murdered women to be very disturbing. And a lot of times there was this equation of, well, they're sex workers. Like this was in the media a lot. It's like, well, they're missing and because they're sex workers, so we don't know where they are, this kind of language. And it's really devaluing women and devaluing, like it's a double devaluation that I found really problematic in the news. And even if it gets covered at all. So there's a big absence of coverage. And then when it does get covered, it's in these very negative ways that kind of are dismissive and lead to a lot of, or are the result of, or interplays with the lack of police following up and just no accountability on the part of, you know, the settler community. It's just like, well, almost like it's not our problem. So I've really found that media coverage to be deeply problematic.
Yeah. Well, it's problematic for many reasons. Like it's devaluing women, it's devaluing sex workers' lives, and it's also misinformed because a lot of Indigenous women who do go missing aren't sex workers. It's just that there's a lot of racism and it's interplayed with, and the colonialism is interplayed with gendered violence in such a way that so many, like the amount of Indigenous women are just going missing is way overrepresented, especially in places where there's resource extraction, like my hometown, Fort St. John, BC. There's a lot of women that have gone missing up there. Because, you know, if you're in a society where there's this devaluation of life, this devaluation of the land, it just makes sense that, of course, there'd be a devaluation of other forms of life and women. But yeah, I guess we can start debunking. So start from the bottom up. Yeah, this idea that settlement in Canada is legal, that goes back to this idea of manifest destiny and of there not being anyone here when Europeans arrived, which isn't true.
You see that in all media, really, not just on Indigenous news, but media and all kinds of different stories. Been like a lot in media covering like environmental issues. Like if if environmental issues in Canada are discussed without like a context of colonization, then that's like playing into this myth that like this is just like neutral territory that doesn't have this like colonial history.
Mm-hmm.
Annie already debunked the warriors myth quite well. For more about that, the first article in the issue actually, Sakej Ward discusses the history of warrior societies, and it's a really great article if people are interested in that question.
Mm-hmm. This idea that we're passive and idle and that we're not participating, and that like we didn't have a part to play in the creation of Canada. Like it's our land, it's our resources that have created that have amassed the wealth that's here. So it's not like we're not a part of it. And if anyone has anything to say, just chirp in.
Just in terms of the resource extraction bit too, there was also this really great article about, I don't remember where it was published, but maybe someone remembers, but it was kind of a breakdown of the amount of how much Canada actually owes Indigenous people for the amount of resource extraction that's happened over the last 500 and however many years, of how much money has been made off of the resources in this country that are all indigenous resources and land. And it was a really great article. I don't actually remember who wrote it, but it's somewhere out there. I'm sure if you searched it, you'd find it. But just thinking about that in context of resource extraction in general, in particular, how like the land is so connected to indigenous practice and ceremony and traditions, and how that is one of the, like how colonization requires that extraction and vice versa. Yeah.
I guess we kind of already debunked the one about Indigenous people being all the same or thinking all the same things. Well, obviously, we don't.
Like example articles for this workshop, and in so many of them they just use the term like Indigenous leaders, they just like throw it out there without even like explaining like who they mean, or if that means like band council leaders, or like who in the community are these like leaders that they're just like kind of talking about in these articles. So I think that one's like pretty insidious, and it's like pretty like, especially in like the mainstream media, it's like pretty widespread that they just like talk about Indigenous people in that way, as though it's like, yeah.
Which is also linked to the next one, that the idea that band councils are our traditional methods of representation. There's a real lack of understanding of the history of band councils, or how they were created by the Indian Act to rule over us and enact the colonial policies of Canada, and undermine our traditional governance structures. And a lot of people don't question our band council and elected chief leaderships. They just say, they're just like, yeah, that's obviously what all Indigenous people think. And they don't really understand like the corruption that's also involved in that, or how it plays into the colonial framework.
I went home. I mean, we were house sitting for our friends, and it was the time of election in my community. And how it works is like the chief and council, they get this amount of money when it's time for election. And how they use this money is they give people liquor, and they give them money. They'll ask them, and then they'll say, what do you need? And okay, and then they'll say, okay, we have only this much money. It'll be $5, $15, $20, or a bottle of liquor. And that's how much your ex counts, is a liquor or money. And then that's how they get their votes. They give money and liquor to the people, so they get voted in. So I had a meeting. I told the chief and council, well, my ex is worth a lot more than that. So if you guys want my ex, I'm going to have a meeting, and whoever appears and sits there and listens to me is going to get my ex. I don't want liquor, and I don't want money from you. I want you guys to do something, whatever's going on in the community. The chief didn't appear. The councillors appeared, and 2 men that didn't appear. So I laid it out. I said, you guys need to do something in our community. And you guys know what it is. Children are being abused in the community. There's alcohol and drugs. Our people are walking around like zombies. What are you guys gonna do about that? Yes, we have alcohol and drug for the people that are having problems with alcohol and drugs. But what are you guys gonna do with the children that are being sexually abused? You guys don't have nothing for them. And they can ban people from our community, from people for doing these things to our children and our elders. Because our elders are being abused. They're treating them bad. They take their drugs so they can get a fix or a high from them. So they're not really doing anything. So yes, chief and council are corrupted. So I rather listen to my people than listen to the chief and council.
Yeah, the band councils are really corrupt. Which is why we need to be getting the real stories out, the truth out, which is why we're involved in the media in the first place, is to get the truth out and tell these stories, because we're so misrepresented in the mainstream media, and people hold these assumptions and myths about our histories and our present realities. So I guess we're just going to talk about, we'll go into the next part where we talk about the ways that where Indigenous issues are represented in the media, and like how that depends on the different forms of media. Like whether it's corporate, state, or independent media, and how do they contrast with one another, and what are the similarities. So we actually have some headlines that we should write down.
Come up, actually.
Oh, okay. So yeah, we're going to look at some headlines, and we're going to discuss what are the implications, the political implications and the representational implications involved in all of these headlines, depending on who it is that's putting it out there.
Yeah, one thing that was really striking when we tried to find headlines for this workshop is just how few articles there even are in mainstream media about Indigenous news and colonization. About colonization, there was practically none that actually talked about colonization as a process. And when it came to Indigenous news, it was still there were very few. We looked up the 5 most recent articles for each of keywords of Indigenous, Aboriginal, Native, colonization, and yeah, there was very little. There were very few articles from the last few days, even maybe only 1/4 were from major media outlets like the Globe and Mail. This is one article that appeared in the Globe and Mail today, written by Adrian Clarkson, the former Governor General, and it's about the importance of Indigenous languages. And it's a really interesting article because even though it's supposedly purporting to advance the cause of Indigenous peoples, it's the whole thrust of the article is about how good it would be for Canada's democracy, and if Indigenous languages are more recognized and introduced to the mainstream, and how they'll be really important for Indigenous people as Canadian citizens. And the whole thing, not the word colonization doesn't appear once. It discusses, it mentions how Canadians just happened to come to this land, that there was no process, no violent process, they just came here, it just happened. And so it really plays into a lot of these myths we're talking about, that Indigenous people are just citizens like everybody else who need to have their rights recognized. How it ignores colonization as a historical process. You see some other myths. No discussion of land. Colonization is being over or completely ignored, as is often the case. And yeah, this focus on representation and rights over self-determination and reclamation of territory. So that was one article we're looking at, and it's just also it's interesting that in this on the Globe and Mail page, which was the newspaper that seemed to cover Indigenous news the most. There's an advertisement for Mercedes-Benz, an advertisement for TD Bank and an advertisement for the government. But what are some other? Yeah, there's another headline, Canadians not racist, but Aboriginal issue invisible to many, says Paul Martin, which is like, also like very representative, like it's focused, like so many, like there's so much like focus on like these political figures rather than like communities and like community resistance. Like we were talking, like there was like 4 shutdowns of like the Line 9 pipeline like last November and December, and they got like so little mainstream media coverage. But meanwhile, like something like Obama vetoing the Keystone XL pipeline, which is big news, but it got like huge amounts of coverage because like there's like it involves like a political figure instead of like community resistance, like changing history. And it's also like this article is like so like self-congratulatory and like glosses over the history of colonization and just like again like treats Indigenous people as just being like another minority that's not getting enough representation. So yeah, so those are a couple of examples of like headlines in the news. And do you want to talk about the difference between CBC?
Also something to think about when we're talking about the state sponsored media like CBC, APTN, versus corporate media. Often the corporate media won't cover issues related to Indigenous people, and it's very invisibilizing, whereas the CBC or APTN, they make like a niche for Aboriginal affairs, Aboriginal issues, and like they talk about it and they have this representation of it, but it's a misrepresentation often because it's always within the framework of the settler colonial state, is never directly challenging or undermining, because it would undermine the legitimacy of Canada and the settler colonial state to talk about Indigenous sovereignty and our nationhoods. So that's something that I noticed when I was looking at the difference between state-sponsored media and corporate media. Which brings us to talk about like the importance of independent media and how does independent media represent Indigenous issues. A lot of independent media is settler organized and run. It's often like these left-wing progressive groups are like really lacking in Indigenous voices, or we're like tokenized, and I think that's a major issue. So yeah, we could I guess we'll just talk about that a little bit. Like, what are some of the issues that we face in the independent media when we're covering Indigenous issues?
Maybe we'll start a list again. If anyone wants to jump in with some issues that they've like can think of or have faced, then we'll definitely want to add them to the list.
Do you want to talk about language barriers?
I'm going to talk about language barriers. I speak Mi'kmaq fluently, and my brain works in my language. So for me to communicate in English is very hard. So my brain works twice as hard because I have to translate in English. And it's hard for me to communicate in the world because I speak Mi'kmaq 24/7 since I was a little girl. So like with my partner, he speaks English. So sometimes we have a hard time communicating because I don't understand what he's trying to tell me. But if he spoke my language, then I would understand. Because certain things in English we do not have in Mi'kmaq. There's no words. So it's hard. It's really, really hard. So that is why I want to do podcast in Mi'kmaq. Because for me, it's a lot easier for me to say what I need to say, and it comes from my heart. So whenever you listen to the podcast, maybe you might not understand what I'm saying, but there's my people that do not speak English, and they speak Mi'kmaq. So they understand more if I would say it in English, in Mi'kmaq, instead of English. So another thing is that how are we going to connect with our people if they do not really understand English that well? So it is really important to speak in your language and try to get the information out that way too. So I've never thought that I was the only one that was going through that and struggling with that. I met another woman in Shubinagadi. She was having the same problem. She said whenever she does presentations, and then when she gets frustrated because she can't really take the information out there as she is speaking in English than she would in Mi'kmaq. So when that happens to her, her brain is like working twice as much. Then she'll pause, and then she'll start speaking in Mi'kmaq. She'll say it in Mi'kmaq, and then after, it clears out, and then she's not getting as frustrated because she spoke in Mi'kmaq, and everything was all right with her. So it is really hard to translate in English. So I don't know if anybody else goes through that. French. That's what I wanted to explain to you. And thank you for listening.
Yeah, language barriers is a huge issue for trying to properly represent Indigenous issues in the media. A lot of elders and first speakers don't. It's harder to communicate, and it would be great if we could have more translators.
I think we'll talk about it a bit more tomorrow when we do a presentation, but and it's kind of an interesting question or issue, because when we were sort of first getting locating funding to begin training for Annie to be doing podcasts, we ran into a whole bunch of racism from Service Canada employees who simply were like, "Oh, well, you don't have this skill set. You don't have that. How will you ever do that?" And it was like this extremely paternalistic, like, "I've closed your file for you. Don't worry." And it was just like, I can't believe you're doing this. So the issue I think is that it's almost like a mental question to ponder maybe at this point, but I don't think that we should just be necessarily turning Indigenous reporters or creating Indigenous reporters and then sort of giving or grading on the skills that non-native reporters would have. And so that it's like, no, you don't understand the fact that Annie speaks Mi'kmaq is the skill. Like, their main, not the only skill, but that's what we're trying to highlight. It's not that that's lacking. She has something that is important, but you're not seeing it as important because you're putting it on a gradient of like, oh, well, not a colonial education. So, back to like that square rather than just like, no, like, let's highlight the skills that that we're trying to, that we don't have, that, you know, I'm losing my thought here, but does that make, yeah, maybe I got it out. Okay.
Yeah, it's these cultural clashes too, in like how settler society views skills and education and even journalism versus like truth telling and storytelling. That's something we were talking about earlier, was like, what is it that makes you a real journalist? What is a real journalist? Who's a real journalist? And we're talking about how like maybe we don't want to use the term journalist. Maybe we want to use the term storyteller, truth teller. But yeah, that's and also like funding. It's really important. It's really interesting that you bring that up. Lack of funding is a huge issue in grassroots media. It's something we definitely faced in trying to get this special issue funded. We ended up, like, we went to all of our traditional funders, like unions and like labor organizations, and none of them wanted to fund us for some reason. But except for one, yes, the postal workers union, who are awesome. But the others were very afraid of the content that we were going to put in here because it's anti-industry or is critical of the industry, and the industries are what drive the economy for those unions. So we found that we didn't get the funding that that the Dominion usually relies on. So we had to end up going to student groups and other groups that we don't normally go to, and it was great. Radical student groups were awesome. They really stepped up and funded this.
So I'm just wondering maybe what you guys think of this issue of like distance, right? Like in terms of media, because for me, I kind of see it like as a big issue we need to kind of overcome, not only for you know, like the media, but also just for like challenging colonialism in general within Canada. So I guess what I'm kind of thinking is like, you know, for those of us that, what is it, something like, you know, 90% of the population of Canada lives like, you know, pretty close to the US border. And then obviously like the more north you go, there's like less roads, fly-in communities. And so I was thinking about this a lot in terms of like the crisis that happened in Ottawapiskat recently. And then like, you know, there's like a suicide crisis, and then like all of a sudden, like all the cameras show up, like all the attention's on it, and the you know, people kind of lose sight of the fact that like that crisis is ongoing, and it's of course linked to colonialism. And maybe one issue, like I just put it out there, but I'd be curious to kind of see what you all thought of it, is like, it's maybe it's not a question of distance, but it's like, you know, especially looking at like more remote communities, it's like how do we kind of almost like force non-native folks to like listen to like what's going on there, but like also how do we get stories out on a more regular basis so that it's not just like we're only hearing about it when 11 youth try to commit suicide, but like how do we also hear about it when there's like amazing acts of like heroic resistance and stuff like that, you know? Yeah.
Funding. We need better funding so we can send journalists there. That's number one, I think. And finding ways to get that funding. I know that there are like different programs. I've heard about people being kind of parachuted into communities to go and do radio or journalism in those communities, but it's usually
settlers just being parachuted in for 9 months and then they leave. And they don't have time to actually build trust or relationships with the people that are there. Actually, what I am interested in doing is encouraging people in those communities to use the media co-op for their own benefit, because we have this platform that anyone can use. Anyone can sign up, become a member online, and post their own stories and articles. And I think that's a beautiful concept because it can encourage people to speak with their own voices. But yeah, does anyone else, do you have any ideas?
Thank you very much. I think I appreciate, my decision to attend this session, because certain things that are not clear to me, I'm becoming aware of them. For instance, I never thought that the issue of Aborigines is a serious issue here in Canada. I always think, of Australia and New Zealand as countries where they have big issues of Aborigines and all that. Yeah. But even though now here in our conversations here, I've discovered that even the term Aborigines is not actually used here in Canada. So the preferred term is indigenous people. Yeah. And again, I never thought that there's any other language apart from English and French in Canada. I also, my assumption has always been that, people either speak English or French in Canada. Yeah. But now I'm beginning to realize that there are indigenous languages. So my question is, how much of these languages are present in certain domains, like in education? How, to what extent, are the indigenous languages used in education in Canada? To what extent are they used in the media? To what extent are they used in the judiciary and all that? I really want to have an idea of what it is like.
Not very much at this point. Definitely not in the government. Definitely not in academia. Definitely not in the judicial system. But our languages were under attack because they tried to assimilate us. They tried to erase our languages. They put our grandparents and parents and people from the older generations themselves went through it. They went through the residential schools where they were told, you're not allowed to speak your indigenous language, you have to speak English. And many children were beaten and abused for speaking their languages. Even at home, my grandma was beaten by her dad for speaking Anishinaabe-Moan. And she spoke it until she was 8 years old, and then she was forced not to by her father because he wanted her to fit into Canada and assimilate and get a better life. So a lot of Indigenous people lost their languages. Like, I don't speak Anishinaabe-Moan. It's been lost. I'm trying to learn it, but it's hard as an adult and as a colonized subject to try to reclaim that. And I'm always impressed when I meet people who speak their language. I'm always inspired because that's such a feat. It's such a amazing feat over colonialism to keep your language intact like that.
For me, I grew up speaking my language in Canada. I never knew about residential school. I never knew about 60 Scoop. I never knew about murdered and missing Aboriginal women and men till I moved out of my community. Because in my community, they keep secrets. They do not tell you nothing. until you get out of the community. That's when you start learning a lot of things. And then when I found out all this information, I said to myself, why isn't people talking about this? People need to know what's going on with my people. That you're being beaten not to speak your language. I'm going to speak my language till the day I die, and no government's going to stop me. Because that's what's important. We were called witches because we practice our traditional way. We are medicine women, and they called us witches. And that is why they didn't want us to practice our traditional way, because they thought that we were evil people. But we were healers. We heal our people. So it's all the government trying to say that, no, you're not allowed to do this. No, you can't do that. No, you can't do this. And it's still going on today. Children are being taken from my community.
The interesting thing here is that in Australia and New Zealand, there are attempts, government efforts to even encourage the study of Aboriginal cultures in the universities in Australia and New Zealand. We talk of the area of Maui in New Zealand, that's the indigenous culture. In Australia, the same thing. So, but why is it different here? That instead of encouraging, those Aboriginal cultures, the government here is trying to even kill it altogether.
Because they just want to get rid of us. They don't want us to exist. Because this is our territory. And they just want to take everything from us. Everything. And they were starting. Our language, our land, our children, our women, everything. But it's going to stop now. Because the people are starting to wake up. And the people's voices are going to be heard.
And there are some small fringe representational efforts to include language studies in the universities, like there's First Nations studies programs or Aboriginal studies in certain universities. But when you go to these classes, they're mostly settlers in there. And I'm like, why are there all these settler students learning my language and I'm not able to because of all the barriers that have been put in place historically and in my life? And yeah, there's cultural studies where settlers are being taught how to make moccasins. I had a history class where a professor tried to basically shut me down in front of everyone in the class and said that my criticisms of certain things that were being read in the class as culturally appropriative were ridiculous because what do I know about moccasin making? She said the academic theorist who wrote this amazing article on the history of moccasin making obviously knew way more than I did, and like that's cultural appropriation. That's theft. They take our culture, they
strip it away from us, and then they say, well, we know it better than you. Now, we're going to be the professionals, and we know all about moccasins, we know all about your language, but you can't have access to it. But we'll give it to the settler students so that they can feel good about themselves.
There are certain, I can only speak for, things going on, and even then not as an expert by any means on the East Coast, but there are intensive language rehabilitation programs going on in Eskazoni and Listugush as well. So it's not just like ripping apart and then reselling it to you. These are First Nations led initiatives where the children are being put into intensive Mi'kmaq immersion programs. So I think before, maybe a break in the thunderclouds, that there is an attempt at rehabilitation going on, even though it is still under that rubric of terrible colonialization. But I think that languages are not necessarily completely annihilated, and that there is sort of, I think, hope is an important introduction as well.
And like, I think part of it too is just that like representation is just so inadequate. Like I know in Vancouver where we used to live, there's like Haida artwork has become very like trendy, even to the point where you see like Haida artwork on like police cars, which is like without any like acknowledgement of like the history of like genocide or colonization, or like the current and historical role that the police play in like keeping down Indigenous communities in Vancouver and elsewhere. So like, and like during the 2010 Olympics, there was like a lot of involvement from like different like Indigenous leaders and like band councils across like BC. But like again, it's just like completely like it's just like almost like a PR move to like give the impression that like Canada is a place like that like doesn't have problems, that doesn't have like a violent history. And like there's just so many examples like Kwakwakiwak art like in BC. It's like in museums all around the world because like the Canadian government stole it and sold it. So I mean, you could go to a museum and be like, yeah, this is being like represented well, like this is like great, but it's often like in pretty bad faith. So.
Yeah, so I guess we should move on to the next issue, security issues. We wanted to talk about how security issues can be an issue when we're doing independent media coverage of Indigenous issues, especially because the special issue of the Dominion is about land defense. And if anyone's aware of what's taking place recently here, there's been acts like Bill C-51 that were passed, and there's been a campaign of depicting warriors as terrorists in Canada. And as Annie mentioned earlier, warriors are people who defend the territory and defend the elders and the children and the communities. They're not terrorists. But there is this push to continue colonizing our land, stealing the resources, and doing so in ways that are extremely destructive to the earth. And there's corporate interests that are at play. There's state interests that are at play because the state is intertwined with capitalism in a very real way. And so all across Turtle Island, and so-called Canada, there's all these land projects or industrial projects that are happening everywhere, and there's resistance to it. And that resistance is what we tried to capture in this magazine. But there's definitely like security issues involved in that, because when people go out onto the land and take a stand, they know that they're putting themselves at risk, because there's criminalization of dissent in this country. And there's definitely criminalization and vilification of Indigenous land defenders in a way that is very poignant. Like, I forget who it was, but one of the conservatives that were in power in the previous government, it was leaked that they had actually put like Indigenous groups on terrorist watch as potential terrorist groups on the CSIS watch list. So they see it as a threat to Canadian interests. So people who oppose the tar sands or mining, they're often criminalized and watched over. So yeah, I guess we wanted to talk about what is our role as the media in getting their stories out, but also protecting them, also like ensuring that we're putting their safety first. And I guess I just wonder, has anyone here in your media praxis like encountered that issue? And if so, what did you do? How did you balance getting the story out with protecting people's security concerns?
I'm not sure if I've ever come across that per se, but I've kind of seen like the inverse of that when I was up at the Unistoten camp a few years ago. And well, like one thing that I thought was really interesting was like, Frida Hewson, who's the spokesperson at camp, excuse me, really puts her name out there so defiantly, saying that, sure, like what I'm doing in the eyes of the Canadian state is illegal, but these are sovereign lands, we're sovereign people, and in a way it's like being really public like that is, in a sense, a form of security too. I mean, not to say that it is in all instances, but like there's this real kind of beauty in that defiance of like, I'm not gonna, like, I'm putting my name out there as like I'm a sovereign person. Anyways, of course, the inverse can also be like a big issue. A lot of the time when people do have to protect their identities, I don't have much thoughts on that.
Yeah, and something that Frida said in her interview with us for this issue, which was really interesting, where she talked a lot about the importance of settler allyship and people actually coming out to the camp, settlers coming out to the camp and being out on the front lines with them, and how that was a form of security for them. She shared this really frightening story with us about this. I guess they were getting threats by some racists in the region who were wanting to, I don't know, go hunting on their territory or something. But they were unhappy with the Unistoten camp, land defense camp, and they were threatening them and kind of spinning their wheels at the gate and shining their lights on them. And a few days later, or maybe a week or two later, a vehicle of people from the Unistoten camp were going down the road, the logging road, to get back to the camp, and they came upon this like big white pickup truck and two other big pickup trucks who boxed them in on the road. And I guess it was dark, so they were shining their headlights into their faces and just blocking access and revving their engine and trying to intimidate them. And so the woman who's driving the vehicle got out and started like gesturing with her arms, like, "What are you doing here? Like, what's the issue?" And I guess these people saw that these were settlers in the vehicle, and they let them go. And that begs the question, what were they planning on doing if it was Indigenous people in the vehicle? But yeah, having settlers go out there onto the front lines is really important. It's really important allyship work. And it definitely she was saying also that if settlers hadn't been out there, probably they would have been shut down ages ago. Because I think, how many years has it been? Like 5 years since 2009 that they've been there, and they've been able to maintain that resistance because of all the support they've gotten and all the amazing media coverage that they've gotten from the grassroots. So again, the importance of grassroots media.
Security issues. For me, it had to do with trust in the media. The only ones that I actually trusted was the Halifax Media Co-op. The other ones I didn't really trust very much, because I noticed that the stories that my people were sharing, that it was being twisted around. That what they shared wasn't even put in the paper. So if you're gonna go in our community and if you're gonna get stories from them, you need to start a good relationship with my people, because my people always have a hard time with trust issues, trusting people. And it's been like that like years, not with me, but like generation to generation. Our ancestors were like that. They had problem with trusting. And it kept happening and happening, and they'd be lied to, and like they'll give them promises and they'll turn it around and they lie and lie and lie and lie. So it's really hard, and that's a problem I had. But now, look where I'm sitting right now. Dominion, Halifax Media Co-op. You don't see me sitting in an office at CTV or ABC or whatever, because I have a hard time, because I'm scared that the stories that they're going to share, that it's not going to be the story that I actually shared. An independent co-op is amazing. Independent is the best. And that's who I would trust the more and the better.
I don't want to talk too much because I'm definitely a settler, and but in experience of covering, being in El Sabuktuk, like it does, like even as an independent journalist, it does come with a price, and I think that also when we're talking about this, it's important not to simply sort of contextualize a First Nations community in a situation like that as sort of a uniform group. And that was a big issue for me, sort of in terms of where these are not necessarily my issues, right? Like, for example, the band council in this issue, which was fracking in New Brunswick, which became, extremely violent and a lot of arrests, over 100 people arrested. One thing that was happening was that grassroots people actually needed to sort of fight their way out from under a band council that had signed off on consultation agreements with industry and with the provincial government. And so at what point is it my business? Do you know what I mean? And that's, to me, it's a big deal, because as a person not from that community, not going to be staying in that community. It's at once inter-community business, what's going on, but it's also a larger issue than simply that First Nations community. Do you understand? It's fracking in New Brunswick, right? So there's a whole lot of people that are involved, and a whole lot of people that are involved from the settler network are actually being asked in this instance to sort of not fall in line, that's not necessarily the right term, but sort of get behind Elsipogtog and a designated war chief. And when that person is linked up to RCMP and circumspect negotiations late at night with other third-party security outfits, and I know that, for example, and it's not just like rumor mongering. What do I do with that information, right? So that's a big deal, and that's where I think it's of the utmost importance to have Indigenous-led media, so that those decisions are not falling on my unqualified shoulders, right? Like, I don't know what to do. I'm just trying to, like, again, for me, I felt like I was an environmental reporter who was asked to come to a community. So yeah, I guess I stood by the mantra, I didn't come here to make friends, which is not necessarily, it's sort of like, I'll find the truth, kind of, like, it's sort of weird, but that's sort of what I was working under. The other thing I just wanted to bring up is that it definitely comes at a price to independent journalists, and that I don't know about the security of that's not my specialty, the security of protecting a source. I feel like if people want to present themselves in an interview situation, then I'll take it at face value that they are aware of the potential. Maybe that's naive of me, and probably is. But what I can speak to more clearly is that, like, I mean, I got arrested a bunch of times, right? I'm fortunate that I don't have a criminal record, and largely that's probably because I'm white. And it was sort of a catch and release policy with me, because I was sort of a weird person to arrest, because every time I got arrested, there was sort of this uproar, like, journalist arrested, Canadian Association of Journalists very disappointed, poo-poo, like, whereas, like, there'd be Mi'kmaq people arrested on the daily, like 5 more, 4 more, and I would be the only person like, hello, is anybody listening to this? Like, there's trouble afoot here in New Brunswick. I was offered money to sort of report on what was happening, because they couldn't really figure out what I was doing. So the police would come to me and suggest that if I were to hear of plots or could find who had lit a particular fire, that I could be financially rewarded. I'm like, my name is still in, last I checked, 7 active RCMP investigations. The CBC, ran a whole information morning session on why in Fredericton, like, why I shouldn't be trusted personally. So it was like, they'll destroy you. Do you know what I mean? Like, they'll literally destroy you as an independent journalist. So that, it was never really my hope and dream that I could become the next host of Information Morning Fredericton, but I certainly never will be. Do you know what I mean? Like, they won't listen to me. And I do a lot of other stuff. Like, I get a lot of access to informations related to New Brunswick environmental issues that should blow up and should be picked up, and they will not touch our stuff. So it comes at a security cost to yourself too, is I guess the point I'm trying to make. And it takes a long time to get over stuff like that too. Like, it takes, once you've been in that kind of situation, like, it's not just like, oh, la-di-da, that was it. It leaves a deep residual impact for years. When you see, like, when you go in a day and you're like, oh, I might die today. Like, there's 50 guns, like, pointed at me, like that. It leaves a mark. So psychologically, it doesn't just stop there either.
Yeah. And that also goes back to the question of like, who's a real journalist? Like, they were trying to denounce you as a journalist and say you weren't a real one. You were the best real journalist that there was.
Just a really quick example of security issues. I was doing some profiles for a fairly large publication, and they were from Indigenous peoples from around the world, and I got statements from people, and then I was contacted very last minute and told to not send 2 of them to the editor, to the publication, and the editor was like, oh, why? Like, you have these, just like send them to me. And I was like, no. This is just a very basic example of like, and he was like, why are they telling you not to send them? And I was like, I don't have a very clear, it wasn't extremely clear why I was withholding these. Like, a reason wasn't given that was like perfectly clear. And I was like, I'm just going to trust that these should not be published. I am not going to like try and make this story bigger than the people want it to be told. So yeah, I think like respecting what people, the story, like as a settler working with Indigenous peoples, like just having that sort of respect is pretty essential. I was a little bit, more than a little bit peeved at the editor for pushing on that. But that's what editors are going to do in mainstream news.
Yeah, and there's also, we were talking about security issues on the Media Co-op board recently, and someone on our board actually mentioned that he was given, he tried to do an FOI on what kind of surveillance he was under, and they actually said it was classified and they wouldn't release it. So I think that they could do that now under Bill C-51.
Yes, we have 20 minutes left, so we're thinking we'd maybe take that time to have like a discussion about like how do we address some of these issues and, yeah, improve coverage of Indigenous news and Indigenous media. So like we'd love to hear what you guys have to say about this.
There's a lot of grants from the Canada Council for the Arts, specifically for language-based, to promote First Nation languages available right now. I know that arts is not necessarily specifically what we're doing here, but if there's a component of that, in my experience working with Annie and being able to tap into that for her programming is vital. So. And that's another way that settlers with those skills can certainly help in preparing grant proposals, stuff like that.
I don't know if this directly answers this question, but just building a bit on what Miles is saying, one of the things that's come up in our research about like alternative media is the sort of tension that seems to be between forefront journalism, so people self-representing, speaking about their own issues from their own community and sharing and doing independent journalism about their own movements, versus solidarity journalism, which is what we're talking about here, like settlers coming in and trying to be supportive and be in solidarity and maybe provide access or be more on the front lines or take some of the risks so that Indigenous people don't have to. So I think it's a really interesting discussion between these two, and I don't know, I'm not offering any answers, but just noting that there's this kind of tension and that it's a really important balance to find so that it isn't people coming in and sort of taking over or saying what should be done, but listening and respecting and building trust, and then really making sure that the spaces that are there for Indigenous reporting are strengthened and built upon, so that it's kind of like a really important dynamic there that's, I think, very fragile a lot of the times, and that I think is really nice to talk about. I feel like, yeah.
Thank you.
I was also just just before this, there was a workshop on Audacity Training, and there was a gentleman there, I think his name is Luke, and he's here, and I think he works for the CRTC. Okay. Okay, so National Campus Community Radio Association, and he was saying that there are spaces on the bandwidth reserved for Aboriginal voice radio, and that they're being held for waiting, I guess. I'm no expert on that, but I would suggest to ask him about, creating, there's a space available, for example, in the Toronto bandwidth, which apparently is completely congested, for an Aboriginal voice radio station, and that exists across, like, in urban centers. So that's another good news potential.
Yeah, I'm really curious to know a bit more about, like, what are the platforms that we have, and what do you all see as like where does the best potential lie, right? Like, we've got the media co-op. If I think of like a good kind of go-to source for like what's happening on the ground now, like sometimes APTN can be that, but like, as I understand, they're not always perfect in the way that, or like, no one's perfect, but like maybe politically we'd want to see them a bit more anti-colonial or something. Like, I'm really interested in podcasting, and maybe I'd be interested to hear more about like how your podcast, like what's the reception been like? Have you been able to connect with people? Like, maybe, yeah, if you could talk a bit more about what that experience has been like for you, and if you see it as like a good platform for like getting your voice and your message out. Oh, I gotta wait? Yeah. Yeah, maybe other platforms that you guys see as like either things that already exist or platforms that need to be built and, for anti-colonial or Indigenous-led media.
The media co-op platform definitely needs work on. Needs to be built. We need more people involved. We're severely lacking content producers and editors. But yeah, Indigenous self-representation, that was one of my major goals in doing this land defense issue, was getting people to speak for themselves. So I said, like, it's got to be Indigenous contributors only in this issue. Like, we can't have it be another settler-led, progressive point of view on these issues. So the first thing I did was make sure that I wasn't the only Indigenous person on the editorial collective, and it took time. It takes time to do it, to do this correctly, to do it properly and with respect. And that's another issue that we're going to talk about. It's like time management, and also like how do we balance like how are we supposed to remain accountable to our subscribers, our sustainers who are expecting magazines like regularly, but it took us 6 months to do this, to do it properly and with respect, and to have it led by Indigenous editors and have only Indigenous contributors, especially going to getting the voices from people who are in rural communities, who are hard to reach, and letting them speak for themselves. But I thought that was like super important. We had to prioritize that, and I would like to see more of that being done in the future, is letting Indigenous people speak for themselves.
I think it's always important to diversify partnerships and collaborations, and I mean across different media spheres. So partnerships between news media and cinema, for instance. And I just thought of this. I know it's a totally crazy idea that is probably would take too much work, but this country used to have newsreels before films in the cinema, and they were used for back then they were used for war efforts and nation building and other problematic projects. But I was just thinking about this, that it would be interesting to bring them back, but Indigenous newsreels before, for instance, grassroots screenings like ours, which are across the country. You know, we would, if there was something like that available to show Indigenous newsreels before Cinema Politica screenings, for instance, we would definitely, that would be amazing. But someone would have to produce those, but they could be very short. And it's just an idea that I just thought of, and it might be totally crazy and not a good one, but thought I'd put it out there.
Collaborate with each other, how to support each other and build each other up in our efforts. So we need better relationships with each other as well as with the Indigenous communities that we're working with.
As I'm listening and like everyone's talking, I'm thinking a lot about how because on one hand this labor should not be put on to like Indigenous people, and on the other hand, like we need to be prioritizing news made by and for Indigenous people. But I've been thinking a lot about like education in like non-Indigenous spaces. Like I'm someone who was born and raised in Montreal, and the ways in which the Quebec education teaches Indigenous history is like very rudimental and like very messed up, and like Indigenous people are frozen in time, and so you're led to believe throughout your whole even on to high school that like Indigenous issues and Indigenous people are not something that you think about in the present and something you think about in the past. Like if my father hadn't been a truck driver who goes up north and who like encounters a lot of different communities and then comes home and talks about them, I wouldn't have known anything until college. So like how do we educate or like reach children in a way that is not putting on more labor on people who are already so marginalized, is something that I've been thinking about, but I just...
And that's like settler responsibility. It's like Decolonization 101 and settler allyship, like learn the history, take it upon yourselves to learn the history of the colonial efforts that have taken place where you live, because colonization takes different forms all across Turtle Island. Learn the history of the people whose traditional territory you reside on, or you were raised on, or you're visiting. It's important to know whose land are you on? What's the history of that land? What's the history of that people? And how?
Reserve is a different language. Yeah. Learn about everybody's language. Like there's Mi'kmaq and other languages, so I just know Mi'kmaq. See, I have to learn myself.
It's Anishinaabemowin.
One thing that I did a story with a a young Palestinian friend of mine, and he just passed me the, it was just an audio piece, but he passed me the, like the citizenship guide, the sort of the test book upon which you will be judged to I am Canadian, hooray, like I'm in kind of deal, like, and I'm not making light of that for people. I'm sorry if that's being silly, but that book is ridiculous. It's terrible. Like it's exactly what you're talking about, and it's like it reminded me of my high school education. Like, oh, there were some teepees, a buffalo was there or something, and it's good now, but it was sometimes bad. And, like, it's just not appropriate. And and so people, you know, when we're born in this country, we certainly, through the education system, if we don't have like forward-minded parents at this point as settlers, I think we totally do not get any appropriate education of First Nations groups, but nor, and that's a huge component, right? Education of youth is huge, but people as adults or children coming into the country also are not receiving an appropriate education at the very like doorstep. Not that the whole citizenship process in terms of like, we'll tell you who gets in as the federal government is at all appropriate anyway, but that being what it is for the moment, the guideline is just, it needs a hell of a lot of work to know what it is to be quote unquote Canadian when you arrive here. Like there's some horrible things that have gone on and horrible things that continue to go on, and it's not on the test. So that's on us too, though, you know.
I just want to share something because it's really connected to what you both of you just said, that I've been sitting here thinking about how this media can also reach people who really who have not been touched by this analysis, and who maybe nobody has ever talked to them about decolonization. I definitely have no answers on that front, but I think a lot of the groups that I've worked with, I'm also from the States, and we have tried really hard to address those questions. It's like, how do we talk to people out there and bring media to people who really aren't in organizations or collectives or co-ops, and maybe never had anybody talk to them about that, and never had that exposure, and definitely not in school, but through any political means. And so that's just a frame to suggest to thinking about this, because I think a lot of these platforms that we've been and I don't actually know about the Dominion. I'd be like super curious to hear about that, like circulation and who is being reached. But I certainly think, you know, we as media makers have a long way to go in terms of scaling up and thinking about how to actually reach people that, I don't want to say really need this, as though we don't need it, but there's a spectrum, right? Like there's people who do need to be spoken to, and we need to reach people.
Yeah, just one thing that I remembered from earlier, there was a strategizing session at the conference, and one of the breakout groups was specifically to talk about decolonizing media. And I think they're meeting again tomorrow during the strategy session, so maybe some people here were there. I can't remember who. Anyways, if people go to the strategy session tomorrow, there's also kind of like a discussion on like some more concrete ideas. Not that this isn't concrete, but like advancing the discussion beyond this.
That's exactly the problem, is that you have a breakout session to decolonize media when that's actually what all of our work should be, right? And like that in itself is like the problem with this stuff, is that these things are stuck in these like marginalized side piece like projects where like you have other groups of people who are doing different kinds of media that are not connected to decolonize. Everyone should be decolonizing their media all the time. I'm talking like generally. And I think that's a problem, right? Is that and it's frustrating also to see like a lot of like other settler folks not taking this work like as seriously. And like, I mean, this should be what the keynote is about, right? Like, how do we decolonize media all the time, consistently? How do we continuously talk about land struggles, land defense, and anti-Black racism, and all these things that are very much important and what we should be centering our work around? As like a non-Indigenous person who I put together news, I don't write news. So it's also like trying to find media and news stories that are from the ground, and it's very difficult. As you were saying earlier, to even find anything is really difficult. And I think it'd be really great to have more connection with different kinds of grassroots media outlets from different communities. I end up going to like particular communities that I know of. I have a lot of really like great connections in like Iqaluit and Rankin Inlet, so I know people who are on the ground doing news stuff there. So that's who I end up tapping into. So a lot of like the news coverage that Indigenous Waves does ends up being about the North, which is great, but also, you know, that's just because I have connections with like family and friends there. But yeah, it'd be great to figure out how to do that more collectively with all the things that are happening across Turtle Island in that way. But yeah, so that connection piece is really important. And I think that when we talk about decolonizing grassroots or alternative media as separate or something as like a breakout group, I think like we're just reinventing that same shit over and over, right? Like that's the crux of so much of our problem, is that it's still a breakout group. You know what I mean? So yeah. Anyway, I just want to throw that out there. But
like just respond to a question that was asked about like the Dominion and the Media Co-op. The Dominion, we have about 1,000 subscribers, and each issue we distribute an additional, usually around 2,000-3,000. We're hoping to have a bigger distribution run for this issue. And for our online content, the Media Co-op, we have actually quite a big reach. Like our Facebook page has 10,000 people on it, and we get like thousands of people on our website every day. But a big problem we have is like a content issue, like Ashley mentioned. Like we have a pretty wide readership base, but we don't have enough content generation. So like if people are like writing about, you know, Indigenous news, or like really writing about like, yeah, we'd love to like, you know, we're really interested in like reposting with other media outlets. So.
And not just writing, but videos, podcasts. Like we have the multimedia abilities. We should be building that up. So let's share content. And yeah, the other thing is going straight to those, having those relationships and going straight to those communities that are being affected. That's like a huge, huge thing. That's like the best way to get stories and to actually find out what's going on. So having those connections with communities and fostering them and fostering trust, I think that's one of the biggest solutions. But I think, what time is it? Okay. Well, thank you everyone for coming.